Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's very good to be here. I was saying to Stephen that I got my name because my father was here in the 1930s. And there used to be, I don't know, I'm going to see whether it's still there, there's a photo of the college in the Spurgeons centenary year of 1933. And my father stands in the back row right at the extreme, which is where he stood all his life, really. But I'm his memorial to the college, if you like, with my name. Now, as Stephen has said, Keith and I have been working on this book for over 12 years, and it came. We describe in the book the origin of it in conferences round about 2001, 2002, which was convened by Viva, cutting-edge conferences of thousands of Christians from around the world concerned with children at risk. And one of those conferences, Keith asked the question, there is all this Christian activism for children, but our theology seems to be rather peripheral and thin. So what about it? So they said to him, well, go and get some theology for us. And then he asked me, and I'd never done anything about children before. Theologically, I've had children and still got them. But I'd never really worked theologically on the theme of child. But having recently been retired and looking for something to do, I joined with Keith, and we got going with the consultation in Penang in 2002. We invented the term child theology, and at that first consultation, Keith and I got ourselves committed to write a book, and it's been a struggle. We've been busy with other things, but actually getting the idea and getting it clear was very difficult. When you get engaged with the question of child and Christian engagement with child, there are just so many questions and topics that come that to write a coherent book about it is very difficult. And there's so many things that, as it were, are not particularly theological, so that if you're committed to writing a theological book about it, you have to sift out a lot of things, and that took us a couple of years really to get clear what we were doing. And then I'm a very slow writer. Keith would have done it much quicker, but it would have been a different book. But what we produced over 12 years is a text that we both agree on. It's not that he wrote some bits and I wrote others. This is our text. And it's a great pity, and he's very sorry he can't be here today. He sends his greetings to you. He was telling me last night, having read the paper I'm going to give you, that he didn't disagree with it. I'm not sure that's quite right, but you can't make him disagree with you if he doesn't want to. But I have my suspicions because we are different people, and we've often been on different sides in the way we look at things, and we produced a common text by finding the things, the positive things, the necessary things that we wanted to say together, and leaving aside a number of things that we certainly did disagree about, or might have disagreed about, or didn't know quite how to put in a common form. Now, since we wrote the last words of it and gave it to the printer 18 months ago, we're still friends, but we're independent. We've recovered our independence of each other a bit. We're not trying to write a common text anymore. The effect, for me anyway, is that I've acquired some distance from the book, although I still own it, and I'm very, very glad of the experience of having done it. And consequently, what I offer you this morning is, first of all, a little bit about something that I think is misleading. In fact, I think is a mistake, which, if the book is revised or when it's translated into the Spanish, which is about to happen, I think we'll alter. But I want to move on from what is the mistake, having warned you about it, to say what I think is positive. And this book, for me, I don't know whether it is significant for anybody else, although one or two of my friends have kindly told me that if they read it slowly, they do get a lot out of it. That's a kind of warning. But it is readable, they say, so long as you take it seriously. It isn't a pop book. But whatever it means for other people, the whole thing has been very important for me, kind of eye-opening in various ways. And at the end of one's life, when you're beginning to feel a bit worn out, and you a bit like Ecclesiastes, I've seen all this before, and all is vanity. It is immensely cheering to see things anew, afresh. So that's what the book means to me, which I hope may come across to you. But first of all, let's take this negative point first. What is the mistake about this book? And the mistake is simply there in the subtitle. And given the way Stephen's introduced me, I mean, this is really, quite it cuts across lots of your expectations, maybe. The subtitle is Towards Child Theology with Matthew 18. And that phrase, toward child theology, is simply a mistake, in my view. First of all, the subtitle Toward Child Theology does not fit Matthew 18. Matthew 18 points us to the kingdom of God. And the entry point that we identified in the title is what comes from that text, where Jesus says, unless you change, you won't enter the kingdom of God. So we're interested in entering the kingdom of God. And entering the kingdom of God and moving towards the kingdom of God is not the same thing as moving towards child theology. There is always a difference between any theology and the kingdom of God. But secondly, child theology is a difficult goal to move towards because it's not at all clear what it is. In the nearly 15 years since we coined the term, and particularly the idea of the child in the midst, it has become very popular. And a lot of people now are doing work on child and theology and calling it child theology. So that there's a great variety of examples of different enterprises that are going under the name of child theology. And if you look, for instance, in the report produced by the Child Theology Movement of the Third Africa Consultation, which was 2013, and at page 78 to 79, it's got a list that people in the consultation were asked at the end of it to say what child theology is, having talked about it for 2 or 3 days. And they give 39 different statements about what they think child theology is. And then the editor, rather pedantically, testily, you might say, comments that he's looked through this and he's not going to give a detailed critique of it, but he notes that there are only 2 of these definitions that conform to his idea of what child theology should be. Now, I'm afraid I think that the idea of child theology, as Keith and I have framed it for ourselves over the years, is still a minority and contested view. And there's no way in which I want to suggest that this is the right view of child theology. And I've got to the point now where I think it's like a lot of terms in the world. It's used in so many different ways, it's hardly useful at all. And I'm not really bothered about whether what we do is child theology or not, what you call it. And I don't want to deduce things from the title, child theology, and say this is what it must be because we called it child theology. And my third reason for saying we'll get rid of this part of the subtitle is that once adopted, the label child theology encourages comparison, and this is very common. It encourages comparison with, for instance, black theology, liberation theology, feminist theology, Dalit theology. And of course, if you carry on that comparison seriously, you would compare it with all theologies of the nation, including, of course, the German Christian theology of the... Now, we know that that's wrong. We all know, without any question, that to do a theology with the constituency of the German people in the 1930s is simply... You couldn't make a worse mistake theologically. But then we think if you do a theology with the constituency of the poor, or the constituency of women, or the constituency of Dalits, that's all right. That's a good thing to do. We've got a problem there. And then, of course, somebody comes along and invents something called child theology, and people say, this is just like those. This is the theology for the constituency of children. Now, I refuse to believe that children are a constituency in any sense at all. And they're certainly not like the poor or like the women who actually can speak up for themselves. It's one of the significant things about children. That children are not aware of themselves really as a block. It's only adults who are aware of them as children. And they certainly can't speak up for themselves in any significant way. My real objection to this is that I don't want to get sucked into the game, the theological game, of fighting for a particular theology. And liberation theology is a good example. It has had to fight for its existence, particularly in the Catholic Church, against the traditional scholastic Vatican theology and so on. And it contends for it by saying we are offering the authentic gospel in a way that will, as it were, reform the church and be a blessing to the world. And it makes a great claim for this particular theology over against other theologies. And I'm afraid that this has happened with child theology, so that in our early days, certainly, and I think some people still do it, within the broad movement of the child theology, that they claim that if you put a child in the midst of theological activity, you transform theology in a way that it needs to be transformed. And consequently, we put ourselves into the position of offering to transform theology. And having spent my life in theology, I have no particular ambition to do that, because I've seen all sorts of people come along fighting their little wars within the theological world, trying to overcome other groups of theologians in order to transform the situation. And at the end of the day, of course, the world and the church largely rolls on, indifferent to what these theological squabbles are. And really, I think their relation to the kingdom of God is very questionable. So these are my reasons why I don't want to say any more this is towards child theology, and I give you that warning. But now let me move towards the positive. We gave the book that's subtitled Towards Child Theology for really historical reasons. That's to say, we were born in a movement that was calling itself child theology. But having done that, given ourselves that title, we then tended to sabotage it in two ways. First, we do explicitly disclaim the idea that we might be setting out any kind of child theology orthodoxy. Therefore, in the book, we don't really commit ourselves to championing something called child theology. And there is a note of modesty about this phrase. We say it's towards child theology. We don't say it's a statement of child theology. So in that way, we do kind of qualify the claim of the subtitle in the book itself. But the second point is the substantial positive point. Our book actually sabotages the subtitle towards child theology by spending very little time on it, and rather by concentrating on Matthew 18, particularly verses 1 to 5. And that's where the point is in the subtitle. It says towards child theology with Matthew 18. And it's really a book about Matthew 18. It's not a commentary. I think it's an essay in meditation. It's a substantial meditation. It took us 12 years in one way or another, and in a sense we're still... But its style is, I think, essentially meditative. For me, it's very close to preaching, and I've always thought that the places where I did the most significant theology, the most real theology in my life was preaching, because in the university you're cluttered up with all other requirements when you are supposed to be teaching theology. But in the preaching, you are kind of nakedly responsible to God and to people to deal with the word of life and not mess about with anything else. It's for me, it's that kind of book. It's a meditation. And it's not a kind of meditation, an escape into spirituality, which I personally am very suspicious of. It's a very down-to-earth, practical book. I mean, a child is a real down-to-earth. And if you have a child, you know, she or he takes over your life. I'll come back to a point in the book where we actually make something of that. So let me pick out some points. Really, this is a kind of brief overview of the book, picking out some points that I think are significant. Matthew 18, you remember, is the story where the disciples were asking who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And in the other Gospels, they were actually disputing amongst themselves who should be greatest. And in our treatment of it here, you see we're not very, very strict. We are essayists rather than strict exegetes. We kind of mix those up. And we do take seriously the fact that there was real competition amongst the disciples about who should be greatest. They weren't just asking a good, pious, humble question, you know, for information about who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. They wanted to know how to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And indeed, of course, that is evident in Matthew, because a chapter or two later, you have those dreadful brothers using their mother to get Jesus to give them the highest place and so on. I mean, it's quite clear that, those disciples, just like people today in the church and out of it, are driven by all sorts of ambitions. And when the disciples asked this question about greatness in the kingdom of heaven, Jesus didn't give them a direct answer in words. Jesus placed a child in the midst of them and then interpreted the child for them. That meant that the child was given meaning for a fundamental theological discussion. That's to say, any discussion about the kingdom of God is theological. We make the point in the book that all sorts of people are theologians. If you talk about God, you're a theologian. Don't run away from the fact. And, when people in church, and even some ministers sometimes, say, oh, no, I'm not a theologian. I don't know how people can have the shame to say that kind of thing, or to think that somehow you can have faith without theology. They don't manage to get on without talking about God, and that's theology. So we do argue in the book that Jesus was a theologian. Of course, and Jesus training the disciples was not running a seminary. You mustn't think that at all. Because no seminary, what does seminary offer you at the end of the day? It offers you an exam and a qualification. And then you go out into, what was Jesus offering the disciples at the end of their training? Dying on a cross. There's a world of difference between what Jesus was doing, training the disciples, and our conceptions of training. But it was theology. It was profound theology. So the child is bound up here with theology. We draw a distinction between a child placed in the midst and what the text says, which is that the child was placed by Jesus in the midst. Now, since we popularized the term in 2002, the child in the midst, quite a lot of people have taken it up and they use it absolutely. In fact, in some uses, I think they don't remember or they don't notice where it came from. And it's a nice idea, the child in the midst. And there's a website from some Christian missionary, I think, actually called The Child in the Midst. It's a very appealing ideal on its own. And, of course, it focuses attention on the child, the importance of the child, putting the child in the midst of our attention. And it's very popular in churches because there's all this discussion about whether churches give a right place to the children and all that. And this is part of it's a good campaigning slogan against the kind of church that wants the children to keep quiet and keep out of the way, etc., etc. Actually, my experience with my grandson, who's lived with me for 19 years, is that he was quite glad when the church let him out to go to his class, because in his class he talked with his mates and he talked with the teacher, whereas if he sat in church he had to, listen and be expected to sing songs he wasn't interested in and so on. So, I think that a lot of this campaigning for making the child prominent in the church as we do it now is just mistaken from the point of view of the child, but that's another matter. We instead followed the text much more closely and said it's significant, it really is significant that this child was placed by Jesus in the midst of the disciples. Part of what we do in the book is really to explore what the difference is between the child in the midst and the child placed by Jesus in the midst. Because of this emphasis that we give to the child placed by Jesus in the midst, I think the story blocks the way to any kind of natural theology in which the child in herself or childhood actually somehow reveals God. That we know God by looking at the child or thinking of childhood. This is a very popular idea. The meaning of the child in this story depends on the meaning and action of Jesus, who reveals and opens the way to the Father who sent him, with whom he is one. Jesus, as it were, had a theology quite apart from the child. The disciples and we all need to have some theology apart from the child. And this is necessary if the child is to illumine some of the issues of entering the kingdom of God. We are not looking for the child as the source of the knowledge of God, but we are taking the unspeaking child. And you note that in this story, the child didn't speak and wasn't asked to do anything. We're taking the unspeaking child as a significant voice in the conversation which God, in his revealing, actually generates. Jesus in this instance is not blessing the child or teaching the child or responding to a child in need. And this is the predominant ways in which we look at children. We think of blessing them, caring for them, being concerned for their holistic development, as they say, or teaching the child, bringing the child to faith, or responding to a child in need. I said at the beginning that all this was born for us. It started off with the conferences that were oriented around children at need, children at risk. Jesus in this story is not doing something for or to the child. Rather, he is taking the child and using the child. How offensive is that to us? Using the child to do something that he needs to do with the disciples. So this cuts across quite a lot of our, what we think is really healthy in this area. And I think that attending to this story closely warns us of something else. We shouldn't read into the Gospels the idea that Jesus was often with the children, let alone that he enjoyed playing with them. Now, in some of the literature, and I think Keith has said this somewhere, which is why I suspect that he and I don't, at certain points, don't agree, because I'm vehement about this. There is no suggestion that Jesus enjoyed playing with children. There is one reference, in Matthew 11:16-19, which tells us that he observed children playing in the marketplace, and he could make a comment on them for the blind people, the blind adults of his generation. But this story is really quite unusual, that Jesus took a child. I'm afraid we did make a mistake in the early days of the development of child theology, which is noted on page 13 of Entry Point, where we mentioned the early slogan of the child theology movement: no child theology activity, no child-related activity without theological reflection, no theology without the child in the midst. And you see what a total claim that is. No theology without the child in the midst. And we kind of deduced it, if you like, from generalizing from this story. But as time went on, I think we've realized more and more that the way to read this story is not to turn it into any kind of general principle or general practice. And that it's actually, when we have tried it quite seriously. That's to say, to bring the child into every bit of theological discussion that we can have. It hasn't always worked very well. So the other approach, of course, is actually to ask, well, what does Matthew 18 mean if we recognize that this was a rare thing for Jesus to do? What was it in this particular argument, in this particular circumstance, that led Jesus to put the child in the midst, as though the child would be a significant help in this particular discussion, which was a very fraught argument. Now, you can go on from there, and if the child is here as the child placed by Jesus, it leads us to the question, well, who is this Jesus who has the idea of placing a child in this kind of argument with these disciples? What is it about Jesus that makes him do this? It's not a common thing to do, not a common thing for anybody to do. And as we've said, it's something that Jesus didn't seem to do on other occasions, and the gospel writers don't pick it up. Now, this question, who is this Jesus, is, of course, a question that runs through the Gospels as we have them. The question, who or what sort of man is this, is something that that awoke the disciples. And we don't, in the book, attempt to give any kind of comprehensive answer to the question, who is this man, or what sort of man is Jesus? We are not offering any kind of systematic or complete Christology, you might say. But rather we do pursue a particular line which goes something like this. Jesus proclaimed, signed, the kingdom of God in its coming near, not in its full presence. That's very important for us. The kingdom for Jesus is coming near. It's approaching. It's not here. He called people to turn and to be ready for its coming, ready to enter it. And that's what this text said. He didn't invite them to see themselves and to behave as though they were already in the kingdom of God, which I think is a mistake that is often made in churches today. He therefore could seriously confront even the disciples with the possibility that they would not enter the kingdom of God. They wanted to be great in the kingdom of God. And Jesus said, stop worrying about greatness. Stop competing. Just get worried about the question whether you're going to get in. There's no guarantee. You disciples will enter the kingdom. Unless you change and become like a child, you will not enter the kingdom of God. Jesus, therefore, invites us to be seekers of the kingdom of God. And this is a point that's really very, very important for me. It's been immensely significant in my own thinking and faith, if you like. Jesus invites us to be seekers of the kingdom of God. Seek first the kingdom of God. And he shows us the way by being himself a seeker. I think our conventional picture is that Jesus was the kingdom, or Jesus was, kind of lived within the kingdom because he was the Son of God. And he says to us, seek the kingdom. That's what you've got to do. But the more I have meditated on this, I think that there's a whole lot in the gospel which suggests that when Jesus said to us, seek the kingdom, it's something he was doing himself and had to do himself. Jesus, the seeker of the kingdom of God, had to find out what he was seeking. It's the kind of seeking where you don't know in advance what you're looking for. And you both have to go out and look for it, but then when it comes, you've got to hope you recognize it. He had to find out what he is seeking and how he is to be found. Hence, the significance of the story of the temptation in Matthew 4 and in the other Gospels. It shows how Jesus was confronted by the seduction of greatness which is intrinsic to the concept and the ambition for kingdom of any kind. The point about kingdom, human kingdoms and the kingdom of God, is that the very reality of kingdom, or the dream of kingdom, provokes ambition for greatness. And this is what the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness included. Satan tempted him to have a kingdom and to be great in it. I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. That's the temptation. And it's the temptation that beset his disciples, because they had the notion of kingdom in their mind. They had the memories of Israel, of the kingdom in their minds. And they knew about kingdoms from Herod and Caesar and so on. And all the kingdoms they knew, and the only kingdoms that work, are kingdoms that have great and less great, and which incite ambition. And Jesus has to sort out, is that how the kingdom of God is? Is that the kingdom I'm seeking? So what is clarified for Jesus right at the beginning is that seeking the kingdom of God is distinctively different from seeking any kind of kingdom of the world. But this temptation wasn't settled once and for all in Jesus. When Peter confesses that Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, he follows it up very quickly, remember, by forbidding Jesus to go the way of the cross. And at that point, we say in the book, Jesus finds himself again in the desert, in the temptation. And Peter is tempting him. Peter is tempting him to give up seeking the kingdom as he has come to see the kingdom of God, and to somehow find a way of avoiding the cross, which he knows is the way to the kingdom. And so he turns on Peter, just as he turned on Satan in the wilderness, and says, "Get behind me, Satan." I think the parallel is very telling. And then we go on from there to say, well, this means that Jesus could be tempted, not just by Satan in the wilderness, but he could be tempted by his own disciples. When they mistake what Jesus is about, when they refuse to accept the fullness of what Jesus is, of the way Jesus is going, it's not just that they leave him aside in indifference, but that they actually do subject him to pressure, to the pressure of temptation. And that's partly, I think, because Jesus didn't just want disciples because he was recruiting agents to do his work, to carry on his work. It says in Mark's Gospel that he chose 12 so that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. Now, of course, when they went out to preach, they had to go out and preach the right thing. And if they preached the gospel of the great kingdom, they'd be mistaking the message they were given. But the prior thing to that is Jesus chose the disciples to be with him. And we know from stories like the story of Gethsemane that he wanted disciples to be with him, to pray with him, to stand by him, as Bonhoeffer put it in his poem, in the hour of his grieving. And the picture that emerges, I think, is of Jesus who could be lonely amongst the disciples. And that's an image I personally think we need to meditate on a lot more in our churches today. because we spend so much time celebrating and assuring ourselves that Jesus is with us and Jesus in the midst and Jesus never leaves us. And we don't actually ask whether we are leaving Jesus lonely in the church. We know he's lonely outside the church. Maybe we think he's more lonely outside the church than he really is. So, this is a particular kind of view of who Jesus was, what sort of man he was, which for us has grown out of simply living with this text within the context of the rest of the gospel. And it didn't happen quickly. And it's the second time in my life that I spent years and years more or less engrossed in a very small text. I spent my doctorate for 8 years, in fact, looking at Luke, Acts mostly, and the New Testament, and Justin Martyr. And, that had a profound effect on my thinking. And now I've been able to do it again. 12 years on a few verses. And you think, a lot of people think, why do you can do 5 verses? You can do that in a week's exercise for your tutor, can't you? You have to. But let me press on. We following on from this point, we say that Jesus says that when Jesus placed the child in the midst, he was reiterating the call that he'd already given to the disciples to, if they wanted to follow him, to deny themselves and take up their cross and to go after him. And we raised the question whether in a lot of our Christianity that's oriented around children and making it accessible to children, we are in fact promoting a different kind of gospel, a gospel that really shies away from the call of discipleship. And I think we do very often, and for all sorts of reasons, we do try and distance ourselves from that call to discipleship. We can't make sense of it, and it's very frightening. Deny yourself and take up your cross. Then when Jesus gives us a child in the midst and says, as he says in this passage, receive a child in my name, yes, we can get on with that. So that, in a sense, we're dividing the gospel and reading these two calls of Jesus as though they're alternatives in competition with each other. And we say in the book, actually, Jesus is reiterating, it's the same call. And if you really receive a child, you're going to have to deny yourself and you're going to have to take up your cross. It's a realistic view of what it means to receive a child, which is what we spend a whole chapter on. Let me say quickly a couple of other things, and I'll finish. Jesus says you must humble yourself as this child, and you must become as the children. And this is open to quite a lot of different interpretations. A lot of people say that this story is really teaching the virtue of humility. And they don't notice the child because they think the child is just an illustration. And the real thing we're after is humility as a virtue. Well, we've got a whole chapter on humility and point out that considered as a word and as an abstract concept, it's very difficult. It's very problematic, humility. And we think that, in fact, we find out what humility is by receiving a child in practice. And when it says in the text, you must become as the children, become as the children. This, again, is a very popular idea with some people, but it leads to terrible mistakes. And you find adults trying to become as children. And I think Keith thinks, but I say it much more uncompromisingly, really, than he does, that that is appalling. And to develop a theology that makes the child the norm or the ideal or the model of the kingdom actually is theologically wrong, because God made human beings to grow up. God made childhood as a transitory thing, highly significant, don't mistake me. But it's transitory, it's not the whole human being, and it's not the norm. Adulthood is not the norm of human being either. You remember how Paul in Philippians 3 and Ephesians 3 really points us towards what's coming after adulthood. We're pressing on to attain to something more than we've got now. But there's no doubt that you can't go backwards, and it's wrong to go backwards. And some of you may know Wordsworth's poem, Intimations of Immortality, in which he has this very gloomy picture that children come from God trailing clouds of glory, and then as they grow older, the shades of darkness close around them until they're a poor, depressed, middle-aged person like Wordsworth was himself, and they think, where's the light in life? And there's a lot of psychological, biographical truth about that, of course, for a lot of us. But all the same, it is profoundly unchristian. Because it's so systematically hopeless about life. And of course you can't teach it to your children. You cannot teach to children that they are doomed as they grow up to, lose the glory and to have the shades of darkness close around them. You can't seriously teach your children that. No parent would want to. So it doesn't make sense. And I think that a lot of this sentimentality about becoming children, and we argue in the book that the way we become as the children is actually to receive the child. And if you receive the child in practice, which means like parenting, living with the child, walking at the child's pace from day to day, growing up with the child, if you like, the child does all the being child you need, and you become the child because you receive the child and walk with her. And this, of course, becomes a very positive kind of practical theology. And I haven't got time to read you a piece of practical pastoral theology, a little story on page 172 to 173 that illustrates that point. Now, my last point. And this is very important. We have this chapter on reception, receiving the child. And then we go on to the verses, verse 6 and verse 10 in Matthew 18. And particularly verse 10. Do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. And you see, if Jesus says, receive the child, embrace the child, be faithful to the child as he is faithful. The truth is that it's very easy not to receive the child, and the world is full of children who are in one way or another rejected, who are despised, to use the language of Matthew 18:10. And we have a great exploration in that chapter of what the despising might be and how far it goes. That it's not simply that some adults abuse and neglect their children. In other words, they despise them. It is that when you look at nature and the fact that we're all doomed to die and tsunamis come and sweep everybody away, human beings, well, we read it this morning, didn't we, in the chapel, all flesh is grass. You get swept away. Nature rubbishes human beings. We're very acutely conscious of that these days with, our sense of being one little speck in this enormous universe. And as far as we know still, I mean, people who don't believe in God like to think that there is life out there somewhere and they're going to find it one day, which is even harder than believing in God as far as I can see. But the truth is that for the moment we are very alone, a tiny spot, and we know that sooner or later our earth will go. I mean, after our time, but all the same. I do quite often think, what will those last generations of humanity be like when the earth is becoming quite uninhabitable? And of course there are some people who seriously think it could happen in the next century. And the way in which the cosmos despises is very real. And of course that raises questions of a profound theological nature which people feel very strongly today. Is God the great despiser? I mean, we say that creation is good in church. I've never heard people say, well, come on, there's a question here. Let's face it honestly. But once people are outside church, they're all well-informed and scientists these days, they all know that it's not quite as simple as that. And we all suffer all sorts of tragedies in life, and we know it's not as simple as that. We do have to ask this question, is God the great despiser? Is he sitting impassively over the way the world works? Or is he to be seen, as in the gospel, as the one who is despised, the despised and rejected one of Isaiah 53? But still, we're reckoning deeply with being despised terribly. And the question then is, you see, what is the answer to this? What is the hope? And it's not always easy to see hope. And I think these words of Matthew 18:10 are really very eloquent in a way, because it says, don't despise one of these little ones, because their angels always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. And I ask the question, well, what good is that? If you're really being despised on earth, what good is it that my angel sees the face of the Father in heaven? I want the Father to come here and now and rescue me, and I am not rescued. So that in this text, you see, a lot of waiting and distance, as we call it, is built in to this very affirmation of faith, that the face of the Father is open to this. And it was a struggle to write this chapter, because there isn't an easy answer here. But it's one of the points where I think this chapter and all this stuff which leads us to have a cheerful child theology actually becomes very, very real without losing touch with the child. We had a struggle to write it, and we'd had a bit of a struggle between us to decide that it would go in the book. And of course, conventionally, you don't go beyond verse 5 when you're doing child theology. Well, I'm sorry I've gone over time.
Thank you very much. You've opened up to us a wonderful range of possibilities and thinking about that text, about children, about our own experience as well. So thank you for that. And who would like to start the ball rolling with some questions? I've still got questions rolling around my head, but the implication from the passage is that the child is humble. If you look in society today, a lot, certainly in this country, children are often given their own head and actually allowed to rule in the family and to get their own way. And what I'm wondering is, do you see this as actually putting an obstacle in the way of children coming to God?
Well, I don't know. I don't know about the children being an obstacle for the children coming to God, though I haven't really thought about that. We do. I mean, this is really why the chapter on humility in the book was a struggle to write and is quite convoluted. It's quite involved, because we came to recognise precisely what you say, that the modern child, the child in our culture, is not humble and is not meant to be humble. I mean, it's not just that children rule the roost. Even when they don't rule the roost, parents don't want them to be humble. You want your child to grow up and to be cheeky and lively and independent and etc., etc. And of course, it's not just the children. We say, humility generally has gone out of our cultural expectations. We don't want humility generally, and so I think that, I forget whether we say in the book, but I say to myself certainly, if Jesus came back today, he couldn't do the same thing. It wouldn't make sense to put a child in the midst and say, be humble as a child. It just wouldn't work. And therefore, we have got to accept that, as it were, the meaning for us of this text is only given if we appreciate and accept that it was done in a culture where it was possible, and where they worked on the principle that the youngest will be the servant of all, as it says in the gospel. And we do say in the book that it's not that children then, any more than they are now, were personally or in themselves humble. It was simply that they were socially lowly. That was the position. And certainly, since this was really an argument with the disciples, if the disciples are told to become as the children, they will say to themselves, these big men, they will say, I don't want to become as a child. I mean, even today, if you say to most healthy-minded adults, you've got to become as children, they will say, no, I don't want to go back to that. I'm not going back to that. Even though the children have a wonderful time today, more than we did, sort of thing, we're not going back to that. That it is an invitation to come down, which we don't like, so that it works as when you put it in that particular social setting of an argument, a discussion, in which Jesus is trying to persuade the disciples of something, trying to get them to and he's not doing anything about the child. And you might say he just takes what is the straightforward, culturally given meaning of the child, or the psychological reaction that the adult disciples will make to this invitation. It will shock them and dismay them. They don't want this invitation, and Jesus yet makes it, you see, which means that they have got to change, as he says, in order to receive it. But I don't see any way of getting away from this problem. And but the other thing that comes up here is that, of course, people say, oh, well, this makes Jesus so questionable. And, of course, it does in our modern way, because here he is, he's accepting the submission and the social loneliness of children and endorsing it, basically. He's using it. But, I'm afraid that doesn't worry me too much.
Thank you.